कितना अच्छा सपना देख रहा था.
While the film uses a lot of computer graphics, a futuristic vehicle in the film, Buji, was built in partnership with the Mahindra Group.
It was made by Mahindra and JM Motors, and also a lot of young Indian engineers.
It's just unbelievable.
I think to be able to find that balance between technology that's available to you, but to also keep the performances real, I think is what makes this movie and this experience very special.
The film was announced soon after the success of Mahanati, and subsequently there was COVID, and then July 2021 they put up a grand set at the Ramoji Film City, and it is supposed to be released in May of this year, but because of elections it got postponed to the 27th of June, when already of course everywhere you can see the posters. There's a lot of interest about this because this is something that is spanning millenniums from the time of the Mahabharata 3012 BC to 2898 AD, which is supposed to be the Kali Yuga or the Kalki's time. In Hyderabad with camera person Nagaraju, Uma Sudhir, NDTV.
लोन मिलेगा या नहीं ये आपके क्रेडिट स्कोर पे डिपेंड करता है। तो आज ही पैसाबाजार.com पर जाइए और अपना क्रेडिट स्कोर चेक कीजिए फ्री में, क्योंकि लोन की जरूरत कभी भी किसी को भी पड़ सकती है।
बस एक्टिंग करा लो इनसे।
पैसाबाजार.com, क्रेडिट स्कोर चेक, आदत अच्छी है।
Some people say the metaverse will only be virtual. One day this lecture hall will be made of code, and driverless cars would be trapped in intersections. But even in this maze of the future, you can't wish away health. It's time to become more resilient. "10 years of Banega Swasth India, we have grown and achieved so many milestones. And now I have a plan to beat the urgency, to stop breathing with difficulty, to relieve getting choked with inactivity. Energize our government, our environment, our society, and ourselves. Everyone, everywhere, every day. Banega Swasth India. One world hygiene.
The biggest democratic exercise in the world. Team NDTV covers it from ground zero.
BJP really had to fight a tough election this time.
Unprecedented exercise. Unmatched coverage.
There is no dispute. जनता को decide करना है.
From polling to counting, NDTV brought you the most trustworthy news and updates.
Hello and welcome to World 24/7. We have a whole lot lined up for you over the next half hour, but first let's get you the headlines. Julian Assange to walk free. The founder of WikiLeaks pleads guilty to one charge, and therefore he is going to be walking free for the first time in 12 years. He is expected to be released, and then he will be going to Canberra in Australia. Many dead and several have been injured in violent protests that have taken place, with protesters setting fire to the part as far as the Kenyan Parliament is concerned. Mass protests are taking place against the new taxes. This is a finance tax bill that has prompted violent protests. The president has gone on to say there were criminals who have hijacked the protests. Israel's Supreme Court orders the government to draft the ultra-Orthodox Jews in the military in a new blow to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that has the potential to unravel his ruling coalition. And Gaza faces threat of famine. Nearly everyone in Gaza struggling for food. Families going without food for days on ends. let's get to our top story, and that's the WikiLeaks founder, Julian Assange, who will fly to the Australian capital, Canberra, and that's going to take place within hours from now, following a plea deal to set him free. 52-year-old Assange has pleaded guilty to a single felony charge for publishing US military secrets in a deal with Justice Department prosecutors that secures his freedom and concludes a drawn-out legal saga that raised divisive questions about press freedom and national security. Assange has long been wanted by the Washington, this is the government there, for releasing hundreds of thousands of secret US documents from 2010 as the head of the whistleblowing website WikiLeaks. The plea was entered on Wednesday in federal court, and this is the capital of the Northern Mariana Islands, a US Commonwealth in the Pacific. He arrived at the court shortly before the hearing was to begin, wearing a dark suit with a tie that was loosened at the collar, and entered the building without really taking any questions. Though the deal with the prosecutor required him to admit guilt to a single felony count, it would also permit him to return to Australia without spending any time in prison.
I mean, doing cartwheels is a good expression of the joy that one feels. That Julian is returned home, well, about to return home. The circumstances, there may be some questions to be resolved by the lawyers and the diplomats in the future, but having Julian home to an ordinary life after 15 years of incarceration in one form or another, house arrest, jail, and asylum in an embassy, is pretty good news.
Yeah, I've been speaking to him this week and just going through all the details with him, and very anxious, very excited, and he's looking forward to spending time with his family and being free, being able to have the sunshine on his face, hear the birds, go for a swim in the ocean back in Australia. So he's very much looking forward to that.
Come on, fire. It's this 2010 footage of a US attack helicopter opening fire on civilians in Baghdad, including two Reuters news staff, that brought Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, into the crosshairs of the US legal system. A freedom of information champion instrumental in the leak of 91,000 secret documents of the US war in Afghanistan, Julian Assange's activism brought home the reality of some of America's most brutal military actions around the world. This included 4 lakh classified military files which chronicle the Iraq War, followed by the release of thousands of US diplomatic cables with candid views of foreign leaders. As America and its closest allies closed in on Assange, WikiLeaks came under intense pressure. In October 2011, Assange told NDTV WikiLeaks could cease to exist.
Over the last 11 months, it is a possibility that the establishment will win. Certainly, it has been difficult for us over the last 11 months to have been removed from 95% of our donations and revenue. We have been surviving on cash reserves the last 11 months. But that's not a situation that can continue. If it does continue, then it is inevitable that sometime during next year, WikiLeaks will completely run out of money, and that will be the end of the organization.
By this time, though, the writing was already on the wall for Assange. For the next 14 years, he would be in a battle to fight for his freedom. Accused of sex crimes in Sweden, which he denied, he was arrested in the UK, his bail eventually rejected. In 5 days, he took refuge in Ecuador's embassy in London and gained political asylum in August 2012. 8 years later, after his political asylum was revoked by Ecuador, Assange was carried out of the embassy in London and arrested and put behind bars in the United Kingdom. In 2019, the US Justice Department asked Britain to extradite Assange on charges of espionage. For the next 5 years, Assange appealed the extradition request, which was put on hold after a court said that the US must ensure that Assange does not face the death penalty. Finally, 14 years after the first set of charges against him, a deal was announced in which he would plead guilty. US prosecutors say Assange did not want to travel to the continental United States. For the last 5 years, Julian Assange lived in a 2 by 3 meter cell in the UK, isolated 23 hours a day. WikiLeaks, the organization that he founded, says Julian's freedom is our freedom. Assange's message to the media: journalism should be more like science. As far as possible, facts should be verifiable. Vishnu Shom, NDTV.
And to get more on this, we have Jeffrey Robertson, the legal advisor to Assange, joining us from Sydney in Australia. Well, he is an Australian world-renowned human rights barrister who's a legal advisor to Assange and worked on his Swedish case. Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining us. How rare would you call this kind of a deal that has been reached? Was it on expected lines?
This deal of this kind has been mooted for some time. It was used years ago to get a man called David Hicks, an Australian who was in Guantanamo, back to Australia when the government wanted him back. It was simple. You plead guilty to an offence for which you're probably not guilty, and the time you've served in prison is taken into account, and they can release you immediately and send you home. So it was that sort of deal that had been put to the Americans by the Australian government, and it's now come to fruition.
Jeffrey, how was the deal cracked? What sort of legal challenges did Team Assange face?
Well, there were a number of legal challenges, particularly the question of whether the First Amendment that secures freedom of speech for American journalists applied to him because he was an Australian. And of course, it's a big question for journalists in Britain, in India, wherever, that write stories about American firepower or the Pentagon. And if they upset the Pentagon, they could be extradited under this 2017 Espionage Act if the First Amendment doesn't apply to. The most good lawyers think it does, but this idea came up from the Trump lawyers a couple of years ago when they made this extradition request.
Jeffrey, is there a part of this case that still remains uncertain?
The First Amendment protects journalists. So the question was whether it protects foreign journalists like Julian Assange, who, of course, published the documents outside America, was never in America, and is not an American. But the view has always been taken, certainly by the Obama administration, that the First Amendment applied to him. So that was the subject, or one of the subjects, of the case in the English courts. So now it has collapsed, and I don't think actually that the Pentagon will be keen, because they do have some egg on their face. They had to accept his demand that he wasn't going to be brought back to America. He wouldn't fly over America. They've had to go to this small island in the Marianas chain, which is near Australia, so he can be repatriated there.
Mr. Robertson, what all has Assange been through during his time in prison? And being a high-profile case, it must have been even tougher. What's the first thing that Assange plans to do once he reaches Australia?
I think he will be able to speak for himself. He very often does. And when he comes out, that is probably the first question that he will answer. But he's been quite ill in custody. He's been in a prison with terrorists, or at least suspected terrorists, for 5 years. And he's been so sick that he can't attend, or he couldn't attend a number of his court hearings. So I think the first thing he should do, certainly be advised to do, is to get some rest and recreation, maybe in a Queensland island or somewhere, before he returns to the fray. He's suffered a lot. He's a martyr, in a way, for freedom of speech, and I think no one would begrudge him some time off.
Jeffrey Robertson, thank you so much for speaking to us here on NDTV this morning. Moving on now to more news coming in. At least 5 people have died by Kenyan police in protests that have taken over, as far as Kenya is concerned, over a tax bill. Around 31, at least, is the number that's being reported so far. At least 31 people have been injured after Kenyan police fired live rounds at demonstrators in the capital of Nairobi. Kenya's parliament was set ablaze as protesters stormed the building, and the ceremonial mace was also stolen. Nairobi's City Hall, the office of the governor of Nairobi, was also set on fire. Now, Kenya's president has gone on to say that a tough line will be taken against the violence on Tuesday after protests against the government's proposed tax hikes turned deadly and demonstrators ransacked the parliament. He said legitimate protests against his policies had been hijacked by a group of organized criminals. He warned his government would use all means at its disposal to prevent a repeat of the violence. At whatever cost, today's events mark a critical point on how we respond to threats to our peace, is what he said. We will ensure a situation of this nature does not recur again, is what he had to say. Now, the Indian High Commission in Kenya has advised Indian nationals to exercise utmost caution in view of prevailing the tense situation arising out of the violent protests in the African nation. Kenya's capital, Nairobi, and other cities across the country witnessed violent clashes and demonstrations after the Kenyan parliament passed a controversial bill that proposed to increase taxes.
We must isolate crime from democratic expression and separate criminals from people exercising the freedom of expression and divergent opinion. I shall continue to lead a government that is fully committed to maintaining the integrity of our state, promoting the unity of our nation, and enhancing the peace and security of all citizens and their livelihoods.
Chaos unfolded in Kenya's capital, Nairobi, with deadly scenes outside the Kenyan parliament as police opened fire with live ammunition and tear gas at protesters who managed to break into part of the parliament building and start a fire. At least 10 people were killed by gunfire, according to Reuters, while Kenyan officials or Nairobi police did not confirm deaths or injuries in the incident. Kenya has been witnessing protests over the past week, opposing tax rises in a country reeling from a cost of living crisis for years. Yet, Tuesday saw the most drastic escalation the country has seen in decades, as thousands of protesters entered the parliament while legislators who passed the controversial tax bill fled, the most direct assault on the government the country has seen. Protesters believe the bill's proposals burden salaried Kenyans, entrepreneurs and consumers, arguing that it goes against President William Ruto's campaign promise to place the poor at the center of economic policy, reduce taxes and lower the cost of living. Since the protests, largely driven by youth-led digital activists, began last week, at least 200 people have been injured and 12 people have been abducted, according to human rights groups in Kenya.
Kwa hapa nimekuja kuprotest reject finance bill. Inatukandamiza sana. Kwanza the fact that wanaenda kutax sanitary tiles, that's really bad. Most of Kenyan women can't even afford sanitary products and they still want to put more tax on it. It's unacceptable.
Young Kenyans have been using platforms such as X and TikTok to oppose the bill, crowdfund, organize and mobilize protests against it. Many are also calling for President William Ruto to step down. Protests and clashes also took place in other cities and towns across the country, with demonstrators setting Nairobi City Hall on fire as tensions escalated. The protests come at a time when Kenya gains global prominence. with US President Joe Biden designating the country a major non-NATO ally on Monday, marking the first time a sub-Saharan African nation has received this status. With Disha Bagchi, Bureau Report, NDTV.
And to get more on this, we have Wanderi Kamau, Kenya political correspondent of the Africa Report, joining us from Nairobi. Thank you so much for speaking to us here at NDTV. Well, the Kenyan president faces an unprecedented rebellion against the finance bill, he says, is an essential part of his plan to build the nation. What all does this include? What has really triggered these protests?
Thank you. These protests were triggered by, there have been a series of taxations which have really angered Kenyans. As far as these taxations were more pronounced in the Finance Bill 2024, this anger started building up last year because there were a series of also taxations that were proposed in the Finance Bill 2023 for the budget for the last year's financial year, and which brought a lot of controversy. Most employees and employers were against the housing levy tax, which was seen as punitive, but the government insisted that it intends to implement the levy so that it can enable it collect enough money to implement its affordable housing policy. So there was anger at that time, but most people didn't. They never came up to express the anger. But now. This Finance Bill 2024, which has been really contentious, is the one that now, some taxations like sanitary pads, basic items like sanitary pads, motor vehicle tax, proposed tax against the bread, 16% VAT on bread, and other basic items. And these are the ones which have really triggered these countrywide demonstrations.
Right. Also, last week, the government scrapped some tax increases, including a proposed 16% value-added tax on bread, along with taxes on motor vehicles, vegetable oil, and mobile money transfers. Clearly, that wasn't enough for the protesters. What has escalated this protest?
Another thing that really has escalated these protests, which are largely led by the youth, most popularly known as the Gen Zs, is some officials, some senior government officials, tendency of splashing opulence, splashing money in public, and contributing to millions of shillings to Harambe's. And while there's a lot of very high rate of unemployment and high cost of living, which mostly affect the youth, which are mostly between 15 and 34 years. So these blatant and also some pronouncements by some of President Ruto's close allies that when the public expressed anger against some of these tax proposals, some dismissed these assertions, and that's really what triggered. And some of the officials who have been fingered of being or demonstrating arrogance towards the public is some of them are like President Ruto's economic advisor Devin D, his close allies Kimani, Parliament Leader of Majority Kimani Ichung'wa, Senate Majority Leader for the ruling Kenya Kwanza Coalition Aaron Cheruyot, and some of his cabinet secretaries. So this is really which has really triggered these protests, which are largely led by the youth.
Right, Wanderi Kamau, thank you so much for joining us here on NDTV from Nairobi. Moving on to more news now, and Israel's Supreme Court on Tuesday ruled unanimously that the military must begin drafting ultra-Orthodox men for military service, a decision that could lead to the collapse of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's governing coalition as Israel continues to wage war in Gaza. Now, the court ruled that in the absence of a law that distinguishes between Jewish students and other draftees, Israel's compulsory military service system applies to the ultra-Orthodox like any other citizens. Now, under long-standing arrangements, the ultra-Orthodox men have been exempted from the draft, which is compulsory for most Jewish men and women. Politically powerful ultra-Orthodox parties, key partners in Netanyahu's governing coalition, oppose any change in the current system. If the exemptions are ended, they could desert the coalition, causing the government to collapse and leading to new elections. Moving on to more news now, and UK's Labour Party has suspended one of its general election candidates after the party was drawn into a controversy surrounding betting and the general election. Kevin Craig was suspended after Labour was told by the Gambling Commission that an investigation had been launched into one of the party's candidates. The development comes 2 weeks after reports reveal that Rishi Sunak's closest parliamentary aide, Craig Williams, had placed a £100 bet on a July election 3 days before the Prime Minister named the date.
This is a change in position from Rishi Sunak, the UK Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party, because when these allegations first broke, the position he took at the time was to say that he would take action against anyone found to have been proven to have been involved in any wrongdoing or breaking the law. Now he is saying that these two candidates will be suspended by the Conservatives, won't have any Conservative support in the upcoming election on July the 4th. And that's because he says the Conservative Party has been carrying out its own investigation into some of the allegations around people seeming to place bets on the date of the general election just before it was announced by the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. That means that he is being accused of being weak and of carrying out a U-turn by some of the opposition parties that he's fighting against in the election campaign. The last week or so, it has been very difficult indeed for any of Rishi Sunak's arguments to cut through on the campaign trail because of the scandal around this betting controversy. The Metropolitan Police have acknowledged that several officers are potentially being investigated by the Gambling Commission for having allegedly placed bets on the date of the election as well. So this is a growing story when it comes to the build-up to the election here in the UK on July the 4th. Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition Labour Party, the man that the polls say is likely to be Prime Minister after July the 4th, he says that if he was the leader of a party and these allegations had been made against some of his candidates, that he would have suspended them immediately. What this means, therefore, is that either of the two Conservative candidates suspended by the party were to win their election constituency seat on July the 4th, that would potentially mean that after that, if they were to get to Parliament as an MP, that the Conservative Party would not support them at that point. They wouldn't have the Conservative Party whip. They would probably have to sit, initially at least, as an independent in the House of Commons. But this has all been damaging for the Conservatives, damaging for Prime Minister Rishi Sunak as well. Exactly the type of headache he would have liked to avoid in an election campaign where all the polls show that the Labour Party looks set to win the election on July the 4th. Ollie Barrett, NDTV, London.
Thanks, Ollie, for joining us with all those details from London. With that, we're sitting in a short break. Back with a whole lot more.
In the India Today Best लोन मिलेगा या नहीं ये आपके क्रेडिट स्कोर पर डिपेंड करता है। आज ही जाइए पैसाबाजार.com पर और अपना क्रेडिट स्कोर चेक कीजिए फ्री में, क्योंकि लोन की जरूरत किसी को भी कभी भी पड़ सकती है। चल एक्टिंग थोड़ा भेल बनो। पैसाबाजार.com
Get ready for the ride of your life. NDTV brings you the NDTV Auto Show with me, Mugdha Mishra. From the fastest supercars to the sleekest new energy vehicles to your trusted daily ride, we cover it all. Every Saturday at 10:30 a.m. and Sunday at 8:30 p.m. only on NDTV 24/7. Your next great escape starts here.
Some people say the metaverse will only be virtual. One day this lecture hall will be made of code, and driverless cars would be trapped in intersections. But even in this maze of the future, you can't wish away health. It's time to become more resilient. 10 years of Banega Swasth India, we have grown and achieved so many milestones. And now I have a plan to beat the urgency, to stop breathing with difficulty, to relieve getting choked with inactivity.
Welcome back. Let's get you the latest from China, where the lunar module returned to Earth on Tuesday afternoon, successfully completing its historic mission to collect the first ever samples from the far side of the moon, in a major milestone for the country's space program. The return capsule landed at a predetermined site in the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, and this took place at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon Beijing time, descending to approximately 10 kilometers above the ground at around 1:57. Now, this is the return as far as the capsule is concerned, deployed its parachute that was completed as far as its final journey was concerned, maintaining a stable posture, and subsequently landed smoothly in the designated area. And with that, we're slipping in a very short break. Back with a whole lot more. Thank you so much for watching.
लोन मिलेगा या नहीं, ये आपके क्रेडिट स्कोर पे डिपेंड करता है। तो आज ही अपना क्रेडिट स्कोर चेक करें फ्री में पैसाबाजार.com पर। लोन की जरूरत कभी भी किसी को भी पड़ सकती है।
ठीक से एक्टिंग नहीं।
पैसाबाजार.com।
Stay informed and entertained with the new and updated NDTV News app. You can watch all our channels live, listen to podcasts, read breaking and exclusive news from around the world and more. Download the NDTV app today and get access to the best journalism and storytelling on your smartphone or tablet. The NDTV app. News that matters to you.
The biggest democratic exercise in the world. Team NDTV covers it from ground zero.
BJP really had to fight a tough election this time.
Unprecedented exercise. Unmatched coverage.
There is no dispute. जनता को decide करना है.
From polling to counting, NDTV brought you the most trustworthy news and updates.
NDTV proudly upholds its legacy of trust and credibility. According
Speaker election after talks fail, NDA's Om Birla versus India Bloc's K. Suresh. And to get more on this, we have Maria joining us from right outside the parliament. Maria, that huge completion as far as the process is concerned, that's going to take place at about 11 o'clock this morning.
Yes, that's right, and it is going to be a significant day because in many decades such an election for the Speaker's chair has not been held. But today in the 18th Lok Sabha we'll be witnessing that, and that will be the big showdown of sorts between the government and the Treasury benches. In the next few minutes we'll know also whether the Trinamool Congress is part of the India bloc on this very issue, or whether, because they have been saying that there has been no consultative process for the proposal of the name of Mr. K. Suresh, what will be their stand? Lots to look out for in the next few hours as we build up to this very, very crucial election which is taking place in Parliament of India.
Right, Maria, we will come back to you first. Let's let our viewers the headlines. The stage has been set for the historic speaker election that's going to be taking place today after talks fail. It's NDA's Om Birla versus